is one of the most important books in the Bible, along with the book of Acts. And in this book, God begins to multiply all of his signs and wonders and mighty works. It's not that he has not acted before. He clearly did. And whenever man had become so full of sin in Genesis 6, he unleashed his fury and he destroyed the whole population of the earth with a great flood. And he, by his great mercy, he saved one family. He put them. He told them what to do and how to do it, and they built an ark, and they were maintained along with representatives of all the animals. They're inside that ship for over a year. That by itself is a great display of power. And in the book of Genesis, we began seeing God's plan, his purpose. He made a promise to Abraham that he would bless all the nations of the earth through a descendant of Abraham. And that would mean that they would have to be all taught in some way. They would have to learn about their God, and they would have to repent and be conformed to the will of God. That's the only way that man can be blessed. And yet at that time, the whole world is dominated by idolatry. The standard religion all over the place. How was God going to do that? Well, he chose Abraham, and then by a miracle, as an old man, he gave him Isaac, and then Jacob, and his plan develops, and you find one of the sons of Jacob, Joseph, now is hated and sold into slavery in Egypt, and looks like the plan's not going too well. Okay? Here are the descendants, all of the descendants of the chosen seed, and they conspire together to sell their brother into slavery. And yet God takes that sin, that hatred, all that ill will, all of that foolishness, and he transforms it through Joseph into building a great nation, a blessed nation in the land of Goshen in Egypt. And yet, then another generation comes along that doesn't know Joseph. And here in the book of Exodus, we discover that great nation that has multiplied by the power of God to a nation rivaling in number their host. And they are enslaved. And they began conspiring to kill off all the baby boys. In our last lesson, we have the plan, the desire of Moses' mother when he is born to save his life by putting him in an ark and hiding him there in the bulrushes, the papyrus reeds of the Nile River, where the daughter of the Pharaoh came out to bathe and discovered, and then took him into her house and adopted him. And then Moses, raised by his own mother as nurse, and yet educated in all the wisdom of Egypt and given luxury, but seeing his own people being beaten and abused as slaves, he interceded and then had to flee for his life to the land of Midian. Now we find Moses at the age of 80. And he is in the land of Midian. He had thought he might be God's chosen Savior. I don't doubt that was also what Moses' mother thought when she hid him where she did. And thinking that it's all working. It's all working. We have in place of power and rule and authority, and yet, nope, nothing works out. But God is over all. God in His wisdom and His power has orchestrated all of this evil into bringing about something good. And so now we have Moses in Midian, and we begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Now, before we get into the conversation that ensues, let's set the stage. Now, he is with the flock. He's a shepherd now, and he's with the flock of his father-in-law. We knew him as Reuel back in chapter 2. Now he calls him Jethro. He's on the west side of the wilderness. That's a pretty good translation of the word. It implies an extreme, the extreme west side, or the land of the setting sun. That side of the desert, in the land of Midian. All that we know about the identity of this land of Midian is that it is in the land that today we would call Saudi Arabia. And it's the land of the Arabs. The Midianites were the ancestors of the Arab peoples. The Ishmaelites as well were the ancestors of the Arab people. And we see that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites had banded together. They were together when they sold Joseph into Egypt. Those 400 years or whatever it was before that time. And so in this land of Arabia, Moses is on the western side of that desert. That would put him along the shores of the Red Sea, or the Gulf of Aqaba part of that, just above where that gulf leaves the Red Sea and makes its entrance in that deep rift, that valley that becomes the Arabah and then becomes the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and going all the way up to Lake Hule. And so that deep fault line, right next to that is the land of Arabia, and this place is at the foot of what's called Horeb here. It's also called Sinai in other places, but it's called specifically the mountain of God. It's already called that here, the mountain of God. And at the foot of this mountain, it says the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. Fire is often used as a symbol of God. Can you think of some examples? I'm thinking about Hebrews in chapter 10. Our God is a consuming fire. Okay? What is the idea behind our God is a consuming fire? What would that mean?
It's where it's used there, and in a lot of places it's referring to his judgment, his justice,
right,
his wrath.
Right. We saw fire in Sodom and Gomorrah, didn't we? Admon Zeboim. And fire came from heaven, and it consumed those cities of the plain there in that Arabah valley. God is a God of judgment, of justice, of righteousness. As later on God manifests himself to the whole nation, he leads them in a column of cloud and of fire. Cloud by day, fire by night. So in that case, the fire of God's presence was light, but it always is a reminder to us that that fire, at God's wish or command, can consume. And they that Abihu were in God's presence, and they didn't respect God's will about the sacred fire to offer in this altar of incense. And fire came from God to consume them. John the Baptist talked about how the fire of God would burn up the chaff in a baptism of fire. Now, in this case, the fire is burning, but the thorn bush, we're just told here there was a bush that was burning. Now, generally speaking, unless things have changed an awful lot, that area has only two kinds of vegetation. Well, grass, there'd be some for the pasturage, but there'd be a bush or there would be a tree. In this case, the bush is the one that is on fire, and yet it never does burn up. So Moses sees this as a sign. What is this sign? What's going on here? This great sign, he says. So in the next verse, when God saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. Now God, we see God calling out. He's called the angel of Jehovah. The word Lord is in all caps, and that's the personal name that becomes important in this chapter. Jehovah. And so the angel of Jehovah, and now it says that God, when Jehovah saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now in the commentaries, a lot of observations made about how the Middle Eastern peoples had this belief that in a holy place you have to take off your shoes. And they're saying this is in the combination of that custom. I think that's reverse. I think this is older than the modern custom. This has been 3,500 years ago. I don't know what the custom was before this. But respecting the Bible as being the mover and shaker of all culture and tradition in ancient times, and I think it was. Anyone who would know this story would remember what God said, and that could very well explain why in the Middle East today, the Arab, when he approaches a holy place, will take his shoes off. Yes?
You know, Terry, that principle that you're describing there is something that you see a lot of times with skeptics of the Bible. Is like, take for instance the story of Noah and the flood. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, obviously the Bible has that story because all cultures have that story. And so, like, well, why couldn't it be the opposite?
Right.
If it was real, so all humanity at some, experienced that, and then, the story as recorded in the Bible has been around, as you say, for so long. And I think a lot of these things, these legends, myths that have evolved from other cultures have stemmed from this. Or
corruptions of that,
right.
Perhaps. That's right. I think that's right. It always bothers me. We do have a large, unbelieving crowd of skeptics and unbelievers that call themselves scientists, and they devote their whole lives to making our world interpreting our world in some way that will deny what the Bible teaches. I know the Bible says this, but could it be? They're always looking for, could it be something else? And they'll look for some other suggestion. Why fight it? What we have is an obvious impact that God had on the world, and He continues to have. And no matter how much you try to deny it, it is a reality. God is real. And God is showing His reality here at this time. Now, the idea of God being the angel of the Lord, some have thought this might be a manifestation of Jesus Christ. I'm not real comfortable with that approach. In Jesus, you could speak, and the word angel does mean messenger. We have too much of materialistic groups today who want to deny the deity of Christ and say that He was a created being, and would use verses like this. It does not say this is Jesus Christ. Now, God used angels to manifest Himself. Now, that is a reality. To me, that's enough. It's enough to say that God used angels to speak through them, and often would speak in the first person. I. This is what the Lord. The prophet would speak, thus saith the Lord, and then begin speaking in the first person. The angel would not do that. The angel would just begin speaking in the first person. And so, in this case, though, the Lord calls out to Moses and tells him to take his sandals off his feet. The place is holy because God is present. And then verse 6. And He said, this is very important, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Why those three? Three patriarchs. Three patriarchs that was his father. Why these three?
Promise was coming through.
I think that's it. Because God first promised to Abraham. He repeated the promise, same covenant to Isaac. And then the same covenant to Jacob. And the idea was, God, who made these promises 400 years ago, 400 plus years ago, now is speaking to Moses and reminding Moses, I'm the same God.
And Moses would have known that.
Yes, he would.
He had that instruction from his mother. I think you pointed that
Exactly.
out last class.
He would know that from his upbringing at the feet of his mother, who was of what tribe? Levi. Levi. Both his mother and his father were of the tribe of Levi, which became the tribe that was the teaching tribe for the nation, to teach the Word of God and the priesthood. So, the point is, God is revealing Himself, and the way in which He's revealing Himself here is especially embodied in this promise. Who is God? Who is Jehovah? He's the one who made the promise and is keeping His promise. He's the covenant God. And that's inherent, I believe, in the name that He reveals in this chapter, the name Jehovah. And so in verse 7, the last of the verse says, and Moses hid his face, for he was afraid. He was afraid to look at God. Why was he afraid to look at God?
You like a burnt bush, you don't want to look at it.
He's in the presence of a consuming fire. God. God is a consuming fire. He's a righteous and just God. How about Moses? Is he a righteous and holy man in his own eyes? Perhaps not. What man in God's presence would be so arrogant as to think that he could stand in God's presence unless he's a fool? Unless he is a rebellious and arrogant fool. And if a man before God is a sinner, without redemption, without any promise of redemption that you know about, what could you expect from such a God but wrath? There is reverence, there is fear, and this concept of the fear of God was fundamental with the patriarchs, with Moses, in the book of Genesis. And it's that fear that becomes the clean, motivating factor to move men to obey God and to serve Him. Love comes along later. You start with fear, and then you learn to love. You start with reverence, then you learn to respect, and then to approach God the way you should, and to approach one another the way you should. It begins with respect and fear. Okay, then the Lord said, verse 7, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh. Okay. Now, try to capture the force of the repetition. We've already mentioned in the last paragraph of chapter 2 in our study last week, verse 24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. All of this to remind us God has never been on vacation. For the deist, for the one who thinks God created the world, He just wound everything up, like a big spring, wind up spring, and then let that machine just go ahead and do what it's going to do. Now, that wasn't God. God was always there. He was always near. He always knew. It might not have seemed like that to the Israelite who was being beaten by the taskmaster. It didn't seem that way. And I think for us sometimes it doesn't seem that way either. When we're having a hard time with life on this earth, and we're trying to do what's right, and yet everybody else is not they don't care, and they don't respect us, they ridicule us, take advantage of us, abuse us. Where is God? Does He see what's going on? Does He know? Does He understand what we're having to go through down here? Yes, He does.
He does because Jesus came.
I'm sorry?
He does because he knows through Jesus.
He knows through Jesus. He has always been the God who is near. He always has been. He never went anywhere. He never went off. Do you remember when Elijah was taunting the priests of Baal? They were trying to get their god Baal to send fire out of heaven and consume the sacrifice. And Elijah says, maybe you need to cry a little bit louder. Maybe he's gone on vacation, Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's asleep. Where is your God? That was God, the real, only true God, taunting unbelievers, those who did not believe in the true God, who did not know who the Creator was, who did not know He who loved them. And so, here again, we're being reminded, God is speaking to Moses. This is Jehovah God, the one who makes promises and keeps them. He's the covenant God. As he will explain in further detail here in this chapter, he says, I've seen the affliction. I've heard their cry. I know their suffering. And I've come down. I see that in the time of Jesus. When Jesus came down, when he was born of a virgin, began to walk upon this earth. John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father. We see in Jesus, God who was in heaven, who saw the affliction of sinful men. And He said, I'm coming down. And then throughout the Gospel of John, He repeats it over and over and over again. I don't know how many times, 30 times I think. He says, my Father, He doesn't say my Father, He who sent me says this. I'm doing the will of He who sent me. God says, I've come down. That's the message of the whole Bible. He sees, He cares, and He says, I'm coming down. And so when He says that in verse 8, I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Remember how the parallels run between this narrative and that of our deliverance from sin, our deliverance from the power of Satan, the kingdom, Colossians 1 and 13, the power of darkness and being translated into the kingdom of His dear Son, into the light of God. We walk in the light as He is in the light, and we have fellowship one with another, 1 John 1 and verse 7. And so He says that I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of, that is the power and dominion. That's the word dominion, which you find in Colossians 1:13. The dominion of Satan. In this case, it was the dominion of their taskmasters, the Egyptians, to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land. A good land. They were already in a good land, weren't they? They were the land of Goshen, the very best of Egypt. What do you mean good land? What was wrong with it? Well, it wasn't a broad land. I mean, it was broad, but they were in slavery. They had no freedom. Do you feel like you're in a broad land when you can't go where you want to go? You can't do what you want to do? You've got to do whatever your master tells you to do at any hour of the day or night. Your life is not your own. You belong to another human being. You're a slave. God is offering them a land of freedom, a broad land where you can breathe the breath of a free man. A broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I've always tried to picture that. Have you ever seen a river of milk? Have you ever seen a river of honey? It's a hyperbole, of course, but it's flowing. How do you make milk? Where's the milk come from?
Yeah.
From Walmart. Well, where does Walmart get it? They get it from a cow. Okay, we know that, right? Okay. How does a cow make milk? Do all cows make milk all the time? You farmers? No, they don't. Okay. Do cows ever quit making milk? Yes, they do. Why? Well, there's several reasons, you know. But even if you're milking the cow, they might go dry when there's no pasture, when there's not enough to eat. If the pasture is poor, if it's not nutritious. I know in Florida, they have a lot of cattle there, meat cattle, and they have dairy cattle as well. But they have to supplement a great deal because the pasturage, it's a poor land. It's sand in Florida. And so they have to have special breeds of cattle that can survive on that poor grazing land. But this land was not poor. It would give abundant milk because of abundant pasture. Where does honey come from? From bees. Where do bees get the honey? From flowers. How do you get flowers? Where do flowers grow? In the desert?
In the fields.
Okay. If you have a desert land, I mean, there's some flowers in the desert, but when you have so much flowers that the honey is flowing, what kind of land are you looking at? Alabama, maybe, this kind of rich land, rich land with plenty of rain and the wildflowers and all kinds of flowers that can produce the nectar. The idea is to paint a picture. It's the land of the Canaanite, the Hivite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite. I always had a tough time with those words. And who were they? And you realize that until just the last century, we didn't know that much about the Hittites. They were thought to be a mythical people. And now in 1906, they discovered that the Hittites had a massive empire. And when they began to interpret the hieroglyphs there in the temples of Egypt, they discovered that the mighty kingdom of Egypt was always at war with the mighty empire of the Hittites. And in the days before Moses, the pharaohs were making invasions through Canaan all the way up into what would be Syria today, and over into Turkey, and that was the land of the Hittites and the Mitanni, who were right there next to them going over toward Iraq. Now, that was the land of the Hittites. But what are they doing down here? Well, the Assyrians and the Babylonians called the whole land of Canaan the land of the Hatti, or the Hittites. They also called the whole land the land of the Amorites. Now, the Hittites were from that land to the north. They were a different ethnic group. The Amorites were more of a Semitic group, and they were nomads, basically. They were desert tribes that invaded and conquered at one time, conquered Babylon, and also other parts of Canaan. The people who were there in Canaan, there were about 6 different tribes of people. Some were Asian, some were Indo-European, like the Hittites were Indo-European. They had a language like the Europeans had. They had hieroglyphs in their earliest writings, like the Egyptians did. And as we begin to learn how to read their writings, in modern times now, we're learning. They had a legal code that was very much like what you find in the book of Exodus. They were a very important people. But they had peoples from that empire had drifted into the land of Canaan, as had the Amorites and as had these other groups. The Canaanites were, Canaan was the son of Ham, right? Okay, you had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Japheth would have been the ancestor of the Hittites. Ham would have been the ancestor of the Canaanites, as well as there's some confusion about some of that. The Jebusites and the Hivites, probably referring to the cities that they lived in, or the word Perizzite, village dwellers, apparently referring to the villages where they lived and were probably Hittite, or they might have been, I don't know. It's been hard to distinguish them. They all lived together, they all formed alliances, and apparently they all spoke pretty much the same language. So they were able to converse at least. There might have been varieties of dialect among them. We have had the blessing of a great many treasure troves of libraries in the Middle East uncovered just in the past century, and it's informed us a great deal about the commerce among all these peoples. Uriah was a Hittite. We have the allies of Abraham that were there. They were Amorites, they're called, but they're also called Hittites. So there was a lot of mixing there. Anyway, it was this land that God is offering to Israel. And God says, verse 9, "And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. That's the plan now. Bring them out of Egypt. Bring them out of the land of slavery. That's the plan. But Moses said to God, verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Who did he think he was 40 years before that? I'm the man. That's what he thought 40 years before that. Although he wasn't sure, you know. We saw that. He looked this way and that way before he tried to intervene. And now he is 40 years humbler. Now he is not confident in himself. That's a very important point. God chooses men who are not confident in themselves. How do you do great things for God if you're not confident in yourself? You're going to have to learn to trust somebody else, aren't you? Moses had to learn to trust in the power of God. So God says in verse 12, but I will be with you. That's number one. It's not going to be you and your power and your authority and your genius and your military prowess and all of the great assets and gifts that you have. It's going to be me. I'm going to be with you. And this shall be the sign for you. All right, now think about this. How is this a sign? This will be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. All right? You're going to bring all the people to this mountain to serve God. How is that a sign?
It comes to pass.
Because it would come to pass. When God says it's going to happen, God Jehovah, the one who made the covenant promise to Abraham, that right now he is remembering and is bringing it to pass. He's saying, this also should come to pass. You're going to be here. The whole nation is going to be right here. That's going to be the sign. God is, now remember, what's happening? Who is Moses talking to? He's talking to God in the form of a burning bush. In the form of a great sign, he called it. A great sign. And he's still having this conversation. Can you imagine that? He's not talking to a man or a woman. He's not even talking to an animal. I know some of us talk to our dogs. Not even that. He's talking to a burning bush. That is a great sign. Is God. And God has said, the same God that made all the promises, he said, you're going to come right back here with the whole nation of Israel, and you're going to worship me. Then Moses said to God, you realize that Moses is beginning to gather a little bit of courage. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, I say, let's suppose I go, okay. Hey, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Okay. What's his question? Did Moses not know the name of God? Did Israel not know the name of God? Did Abraham know the name of God? Yes, they did. Of course they did. Go back to Genesis 12, Genesis 15. God there is called Jehovah as he is here. He's called Jehovah there. They knew Jehovah. I have an idea that the whole nation of Egypt knew Jehovah through Joseph. How could they not know him? What did they not know about Jehovah? They didn't know the Jehovah who was about to save Israel from Egyptian bondage and bring him to this place. Who is he? What's his name? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now that's pretty strange language, isn't it? What do you think he is implying? To a people in Egypt who worship every conceivable god, they worship the gods of every animal in their world. They worship the gods of the stars and the sun and the moon. Their gods were the creation. And they all had different names. Every god had a different name. What's the name of this God? I am that I am. Okay. Is there any God with a name like that? No. This is not really a name. It is a name, but it's a description, is it not? It's who is God? It is not creation. It is the I am. You ever played that game? Daddy, who made the stars? And you say, well, God made the stars. And then your son says, who made God? Who made God?
Thinking in human terms. We do that.
I'm sorry?
We're thinking in human terms.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Are we? But, if the unbelievers have it all figured out, we all evolved from lower life forms. Where did the lower life forms come from? Well, they came from, a primordial soup. And there was some kind of energy that acted on that and created the life. Where did that come from? Well, there was, at one time, there was this great explosion. And then you ask the question, and where did that come from? And what made it explode? What is behind all of that? You still have to find something, someone eternal. Now they'll create matter. They'll make matter eternal. We'll try to make it that way, but that doesn't fit what we observe about matter. Matter is made of energy. It's an arrangement. It's a created arrangement of energy. We know that now. Where'd that come from? You still get back to the self-existent one, the I am.
No beginning and no end.
No beginning, no end, not made by anybody. The I am. And that is, the name Jehovah, J-A-H is the verb that he uses here, I am. Okay? Jah is am. I am. You don't have to use personal pronoun in this language. Like in Spanish, you can say soy, and that means I am. You don't say I am. You have to say yo soy. When you say soy, you got the yo already, and that's the way languages are. I am. Jah. I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. Thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. You remember Peter in his letter? I write these words to remind you of all of these things. God's word is to be remembered. God himself is to be remembered. But this is talking about him remembering. We need to remember that he remembers. We have a covenant with our God. God made that covenant. We are just his creatures. And God does not lie. Hebrews 6. It is impossible for God to lie. God swore an oath to Abraham. God swore an oath to give assurance to mankind. God does not, God cannot fail to do what He says. He remembers. And when He does what He promised, He says, I remember my promise. I remember my covenant. And that's all tied up. Who is this God that's speaking to you? It's a God who promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that I'm going to give you this land. That's what He said. That's the God that's sending Moses to them. The being one, the I am that I am, who never fails, because He is the Creator who is righteous and holy forever and ever and always will be for all generations.
You know, Terry, it's
Yes.
fun to kind of see when Jesus takes this and presents Himself that way to the Jews of His time, and you can see, you know, the meaning there that He's piggybacking on this story as well as other things that they knew. But you also see very much a parallel to the way Paul presents God to the Athenians in Acts 17. You know, he presents their gods versus the God that made all of this.
That's it.
And it's very much the same thing. It's
Very much the same.
Yeah.
It is. You know, these truths don't change, and that's what I'm trying to communicate. In chapter 3 of Exodus, these are eternal truths. And these are foundational for the Bible. And in fact, the whole book, the laws that God gave through Moses, these are wise laws. These are the laws from the mind of God, and each one has its purpose for us to try to understand. And it reveals us so much about He who has made His promises, who has a definite idea about how we ought to live. And if we will trust Him and accept His prescription for our lives, we will find blessing that we can't imagine. Because God knows us. He made us. He made our world. Our time